Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about writing and reviewing research proposals. And this is supposed to serve as a resource for you. Kate Jackson and I are going to present on this together. And I'll be presenting more of the perspective of someone who's written grants and who's also reviewed. And just so you have a sense of my background, most of my grants have been for the National Institute of Health or for foundations. And my reviewing has been for a variety of organizations, but they include the National Institute of Health. So I'm really going to take that perspective while presenting to you on this topic. And Kate is going to really talk about the grant that she recently got, and that's sort of central to our research activities in core course. So it'll take what I'm talking about and really put it in a perspective that you understand and that'll be useful for core course. Okay. So we're going to start with some general tips to consider when writing a research proposal. So when you're writing a research proposal, one of the important things to do is to really think like an advertising executive. You need to sell it. So your main job as a grant writer is to sell your product and to make it compelling to people. So it's important to really convey your idea and your program and what's exciting about your research. And whatever it is that you're trying to get funded, you want the reviewers to read about it and to say, yes, this is important. So you want that to sort of jump off the page. Otherwise, it doesn't really have a chance of getting funded. You also want to make sure that your reviewers understand what your idea is. And I think this is sort of a perspective taking issue, but sometimes we feel so passionate about our ideas or what interests us that we assume that others will just intuitively get that. But you should probably go into it assuming that they won't. So you want to make it crystal clear why this topic or this idea is really exciting and convince them, assume that you're going to have to convince your audience.
Hey everyone, it's Kate. And as Laura mentioned, I'm going to be providing the context around the ACL funded STEP project that you're working on this year as a part of the research project. And just to echo what Laura said, we spent a lot of time really crafting our what's the project need, what's the current situation and landscape, and how do we really hit that message home up front and capture the reader's attention early on. In the proposal, the project relevance and current needs section was only 15 points out of 108 points, but we spent a lot of time on that section really crafting, that there's a crisis in rehabilitation services in New York State, and felt that that was really important. And it was funded, so I think our strategy worked, but I really think, we had to think really long and hard about how do we hit this home up front so our readers really understand what we're trying to say.
Okay. An important thing to do also is to really know your target audience. So when you write a grant, there's a bunch of people who have to read it and judge it. So you have a grant committee. And not all the time, but sometimes, like for NIH, for example, they actually have lists of the people who are on the different review committees. So you have a sense of who they are and you can kind of look them up and have a sense of what their background is or what their interests might be. In a lot of cases, you don't get that information with other organizations, but you may get a sense of, if you submit a grant on autism, maybe it'll be reviewed by autism researchers. It may also be reviewed by parents, and it may also be reviewed by people with autism or other providers. So you really want to get a sense of who will be reading your work and what they might understand about it, because you want it to be accessible to them. You also want to get a sense of how you'll be judged. So often there are very lengthy directions that come with the proposal. And so you want to read through them and know what you get points for and what you don't, because you really want to spend time on the things that will earn you points, because that'll lead to you getting funded.
So for the STEP project, it's funded by the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and they actually they have a page that lists what criteria they want their reviewers to have. And for our project, they actually sent out kind of a request for reviewers because they were looking for specific people to be on the reviewing committee. And so, they wanted, like Laura was saying, they wanted reviewers with lived experience on, reviewing these projects. They wanted, you said, mid-management level or higher on the reviewing committee. So we knew that. And so when we were writing the grant, we wanted to make sure the language was accessible to the people who are going to be reviewing our proposal.
Okay. And regardless of who's reviewing it, even if you have, sometimes you'll write a grant and you'll look at the list of reviewers and you'll notice that someone who's sort of like the head of a field might be reviewing your grant, which can be really intimidating. But even if that's the case, you want to keep your grant really simple, even if your reviewers are really smart or people that you look up to a lot, because regardless, that person, when they're reviewing, probably gets an enormous pile of grants that they're going to have to go through. So you want to keep it simple enough so that they can just review your project, get a sense of what it's about, and really make an assessment about it. You don't want them to have to work very hard.
For the STEP project, this is a federal grant, and so we weren't assuming that every reviewer had knowledge of the New York State system, and so we tried really hard to make the nuances of New York and the complex system that is New York come across as readable and digestible. And we found that using charts and graphs really helped us get that message across, that we were mirroring what was being said in the prose through charts and graphs to help the readers digest what we were trying to describe.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the National Institute of Health review criteria. And even though you may never apply for the National Institute of Health, keeping these criteria in mind can be really helpful, because many of us will end up at organizations or institutions where we may apply for some kind of grant. It may be a service grant or a grant just for some additional funds to support what we're doing. And I think these criteria help for really any kind of grant. So the 5 criteria that all proposals are judged on, at least for NIH, are the significance of the research, the investigators, so who's involved in the study, innovation, so what's new or cutting edge about the research, the approach, so this has to do with how the research gets done. Is it feasible and can it really happen? And finally, the environment. So that's the institutions involved, and not only the place, but the facilities that are available. Do they actually have what you need to do the grant? And I'm going to go into each of these separately. So significance is the first of the 5 criteria. And again, the question here is really, why is this program or why is this project important? And this is really important to drive home because it's kind of the hook. And anyone who's reading a proposal should know why you think it's important. You want to really convey whether it addresses any gaps or barriers that exist. So if it's a service grant, you want to make it clear what services are out there, what's really missing, and how your project is going to address what's missing or what's getting in the way. If the program is funded, you want to make it clear what will change and change for the better, and who it'll help and how this program will help others. And again, I'm just highlighting the importance of writing about the gap. And I always use the words "the gap" when I'm writing a proposal, because I want it to be crystal clear for reviewers. So I always lay out a situation, and then I talk about either the gap in our knowledge or the gap in our services, and then I have a sentence that specifically explains how this project will address the gap. Because you want that to be clear, because that's what makes the project really important. Okay. Next are the investigators or personnel who are on the project. So they just ask for a list of everyone. You have to include something often called bio sketches, which are like 4-page CVs that really highlight each investigator's previous work and their education. Um, you want to really highlight that they have the skills involved to actually do the job. So even if you have a great investigator, if they've never worked on a project like the one you're proposing, you don't want to present a laundry list of all of the projects that they've done. You really want to highlight how their past experience will make this project work. You want to be specific about what roles people will have and make sure that the roles that they have make sense based on their education and their skill sets, and how project leaders and staff will communicate with one another, whether there's a specific organizational structure. So sometimes you'll be bringing people together from different organizations. Like I can use Lend as an example. In our program here, we have faculty from 3 different institutions and then also from the community. And so we really had to make it clear how we would all communicate with each other and coordinate and what that structure looks like. So that's important to include in a grant. Um, and this just shows an example of pulling people together and just showing how they would work together. So on this particular project, I show an IT specialist, a social worker, a program director, and a self-advocate who will do community outreach. So you want to sort of say what people's titles are, but also what their roles will be and how their experience will make it possible for them to fulfill those roles. So the next part is innovation. And innovation is really important because you want to show that a project is proposing something new and forward thinking. You want to show that it's novel. It's not something that's just already happening. And things that are innovative really cause a shift in the current thinking and practices or organizational structures that exist already. So that's what you want to convey in the innovation section. And here I have an example of what would be innovative. So, all of us carry around our smartphones. And what was really innovative about a smartphone is it's really a paradigm shift. So prior to that, we had, a telephone, a camera, a flashlight, a tape recorder, and they would all play these different roles in our lives. And the smartphone really brought them all together for the first time in something you could just fit in your hand or fit in your pocket. So that's sort of what you want to do with your research. Now, not every research project is going to be innovative like the smartphone, but I think you want to scale it down and just think about if you're doing something smaller scale, how does that push the envelope forward? Next is the approach. So for the approach section, you really want to think about your method or your plan. And this is, to some degree, a step-by-step guide of exactly what you're going to do. I sometimes think of it, for those of you who might cook, as like a recipe. You need to have all the ingredients and then the steps. And if you don't have the ingredients, or if you do the steps in the wrong order, it's not going to work. So it needs to really make sense and be intuitive based on what your goals are. And so you want to make sure that you take your approach and you kind of match it up with some of the, the significance and the innovation, and make sure that when you state specific goals, your approach will actually help you meet those goals. Reviewers care a lot about the feasibility of a project. So when I have reviewed for NIH or for other organizations, there are times when I've given a grant a really poor score, even when the idea is great, because either I know that they may not have the facilities or the expertise to pull off the grant, or sometimes they have to run so many participants through the study, it's not remotely possible that they would be able to do it. They would need to partner with other organizations in other states to have enough people involved. So you want to make sure that when you think about your approach, you're proposing something that you can do and that you can do it within the time frame that they're proposing and with the manpower that you're able to provide. Because the scary thing is if you get funded and your approach isn't feasible, you're the one who's going to have to scramble to make it work once you're funded, and that can be a scary moment. So you want to try to think of that ahead of time. You also want to think about what the benchmarks would be for success. And I think it's really helpful. I mean, I can be a pessimist, but I like to think about lots of things that could go wrong beforehand or while I'm writing the grant. And then I try to think about alternative strategies. So if this doesn't work, this is how we'll address it. And I like to be really upfront about that in grants, because it helps me if I get funded and things go wrong, but it also helps show the reviewers that I've thought it through and that I don't have this overly rosy view that everything's just going to go as planned, that I'm ready for things to not work the way that we plan them, or for barriers to come up. And then you really want to think about bias. You want to make sure that when you're doing a study, that your approach is as unbiased as possible. So if you have a hypothesis that you're testing and you assume that your hypothesis is right, you don't want to set up the study so that it could only prove that it's right. You want there to be an equal chance that it's proven or disproven. So you need to make sure that there isn't bias in your design. And that's a really important aspect of research. And that's why it's important also to run proposals by lots of people who may not have the same views as you. So this just shows sort of a path, because it's kind of like the recipe idea. If you have an approach, you want to read through that approach and make sure that if you start with step 1 and then move to step 2 and step 3 and so on, that you could progress through the study. So you really want to imagine what those steps would be like and make sure that you have logical steps that make sense and can actually work. Okay, the fifth part of a proposal is the environment. So this is where the project will take place. So, the reviewers will want to know that you're at an institution that can support the project. And that means in terms of this is where the minutia comes in. So do you have office space? Do you have desks and telephones? If you're doing something more complex, like I did an eye tracking study once, do we have eye trackers? Do we have personnel who can support that, or IT people? So you really will want to explain in detail what the environment is, whether there's adequate space, and adequate numbers of participants or consumers who can access your program or really be involved in your research study. And again, if that's not possible, it's better to figure that out while you're writing the grant than to get funded and to figure it out after you've gotten funded, because then you can get stuck. And, again, this just sort of shows the environment. You really want to take stock of what's right in front of you. And then if, let's say you're in a certain department or a certain part of an organization, if your part doesn't have everything you need, you want to partner with other people and figure out how to fill in the gaps. Okay. So next I'm going to talk about the parts of a proposal. I'll just go through one at a time. So the abstract is the first part of a proposal. The word counts change depending on what you're applying for, but it's usually something like about 250 words or less. And it's supposed to be a soundbite. It's supposed to really capture the sort of attention and imagination of the reader. It should highlight the current problem, how the project addresses this problem, and some of the basic features of the project, like the method, the ways in which it's innovative. So it almost takes those 5 different criteria that I talked about, and it just sort of throws them all together in the abstract. Usually information about the investigator and the environment aren't in there, but everything else is. It's like, why is it important? What's the significance? And what are you going to do? And again, this is the hook. So for review committees, often the whole review committee only reads the abstract of a given grant, at least for NIH. And then certain reviewers are assigned to review a complete proposal. For each proposal, there are usually 3 reviewers who review each proposal in entirety, but the whole group only reads the abstract. So you want to make the abstract really good. Actually, the abstract, and I should say, oh, you can go on.
And so you have access to the STEP project, the full submission of our proposal. And so the abstract's in there as well as, the entire proposal so you can read it. But as Laura was saying, what we did was we wrote the whole proposal first, and then we took elements from the different sections to do the abstract, which was just a 1-pager that outlined the problem that we were trying to address, that there's a crisis with day hab services in New York State, and then our solution that we were going to pull together this participatory collaborative that was going to use research methods to study the barriers and come up with some policy and programmatic solutions. And so, in a nutshell, we described what this year-long project was going to do in 1 page. We had 4 key goals that are fleshed out in our approach section, but we just did a high-level overview of exactly what was going to go on in that year. So it was a soundbite that people could digest quickly and know, okay, this is what they're going to do. Yeah, and the tie it in a bow, make it pretty. This is, we are going to, in a 1 sentence, we're going to do a comprehensive review and analysis that leads to policy and programmatic interventions to make the employment system for people with IDD better in New York State. And so the project relevance and current need was the first section of our proposal. It was a 15-point section, and this is where we outlined, what's the current landscape in New York State, and what are the current problems, and then, as Laura was talking about, what's the gap and how are we going to fill it with this project, and what are the potential benefits that could come with filling the gap. Laura, I don't know if you want to talk about the roadmap analogy any more than that.
Well, I think that's good.
In our application, they really wanted to see that we had been thoughtful about talking to others about the current need. So I had mentioned that we used a lot of graphs and charts to kind of describe, situations that we also were describing in the prose. So this was a chart that we created that really showed that we had done an analysis of existing data. We did 20 hours of virtual interviews with people across the state, fleshing out our proposal and our ideas. And that's how we came up with the elements of the grant. So really making the case that we had done our homework to come up with this proposal that was feasible. Specific goals. So we really fleshed out the main goals of our project, that we were going to create this steering committee and statewide consortium that was going to conduct this comprehensive review and analysis, and that what we found through that we were going to disseminate. So we had kind of punchy goals that we fleshed out more in our approach. And so the approach is kind of the meat and potatoes. That was the biggest weighted section of the grant. For ours, it was a 40-point section. And this is where you flesh out the actual steps that are going to be involved in achieving those 4 goals I just mentioned, describing who's going to be involved, where it's going to take place, what procedures are we going to follow? You know, how are we going to measure success? What are some limitations and what's the timeline? Our application had an MOU section, so it was a partnership project. So they wanted to see that these partnerships were in place, and so that was a weighted section of the grant. We memorandum of understanding is what MOU stands for, and so we had to have these agreements in place with the different partners that we were suggesting we're going to work on this project, and they're signed agreements that this is what our partnership is going to look like if you were to fund us. And Laura, I don't know if that's typical in some of the projects you've worked on.
I think it's called something different, but you usually need to have some letters of support or other assurances ahead of time that if you're partnering with other groups or you're using the resources of other groups, that there is documentation and proof that those other groups are ready and willing to collaborate. And it sometimes explains the extent to which they will do so.
And I don't know, you know, if this is true for you, but from the time that our RFP was posted and then it was due kind of 2 months later, I underestimated the amount of time it was going to take to get all of these agreements in place. And so it's a heavy lift to write a grant, but if it's a partnership grant and you're fleshing out some of what Laura was talking about, the different roles and responsibilities, and if it crosses different agencies, I think I just would caution, or it's a lesson learned for me that some of these smaller weighted items do take a lot of time and effort to make happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think that sometimes when you're writing a grant, you feel the sheer weight of it, like how important it feels. But when you're working with potential partners, it's like one more letter that they have to write. They might be excited about the project, but in a sort of different way. So it may be much more low priority in terms of writing the letter. So it does take a lot of time and reminders and relationship building and other things like that to make sure that you get everything you need. Even if a partner is really excited about it, it just often seems like a lower priority item for people.
And then, you know, the budget is always included. You know, how much is your project going to cost? And that's estimating travel costs. If you're paying your partners through subcontracts, it's negotiating how much is your time worth, budgeting for computers and software, and then the different key personnel on your project.
Yeah, and I would just say related to budget, I always, when I'm thinking about the budget for a grant, I almost try to imagine in my head a dress rehearsal. Like if I start on day one and these are the things I said I'm going to do, what will each step look like? And of course, you can't figure it all out, but you want to think of like all of the personnel almost as actors. Like I need these people. And then the environment is like the set. And then you have all of the stage props. Like if you're going to, you know, recruit people to be in your study, you either have to call them, you have to email them, you have to put up posters, you may send out letters. So you have to, oh, there it is, it's a dry run. So you have to think about, what is that going to cost? There are stamps, there are envelopes, there are copy fees. There's the person who's doing all of that. There's someone whose time it's going to take to post your posters or email them out or call people back and forth. So you need to take all of that into account because all of the steps of your method become sort of dollars and cents when you're thinking about a budget.
And again, Laura, I don't know your experience, you know, but for us with this grant, I sat down with our finance director and I did the dollars and cents exercise in a fancy, Excel spreadsheet that had formulas in there. But, you know, we worked through that, but then you had to do a narrative budget justification where you're really fleshing out and providing a rationale for all of the costs associated in that beautiful spreadsheet that you come up with.
Yeah.
It was kind of a more involved process. I'm new to grant writing, so it was a more involved process, the budgeting process, than I originally thought it was.
Yeah, no, there are the numbers, and then there's also the rationale for every cost that's in there. And, there are a lot of things that you may not think about, like you have to take into account if it's a multi-year grant. There are often, people may get raises each year based on a certain percentage of their salary. So you want to take those into account if they're routinely given by an organization. You want to kind of think about inflation a little bit, even when it comes to costs of certain items that you may need. So, like stamps, for example, if you're sending stuff out, the post office increases the cost of stamps unless you get those forever stamps your first year. So, there are things like that that you have to think of, and that's why it's important to have someone like, one of your business people working with you who can really help you put it in a spreadsheet and think about what language you need for your justification.
And I think, the budget piece ties back to the feasibility, right? Like oftentimes
Yeah.
we knew that this grant, the STEP project, capped at $100,000. So it wasn't a lot of money. And so we kept checking ourselves saying, what can we reasonably do with $100,000 that takes into account our staff time, the travel that our research methods, was suggesting. This is all pre-COVID. Travel that was going into all of it, and trying to estimate our subcontracts, saying this is what we're hoping you can do for us, can you do it with $5,000? And so I think that working backwards was a new and different exercise for me too.
Yeah, and I think as tedious as it is, the budget and the budget justification are really important because they show you whether you can pull off feasibly in any way the ideas that you have. And if you get really stuck on the budget justification, it maybe tells you maybe this isn't feasible and you have to change the scope. So maybe it has to be a smaller study, and this is like step one in a series of studies that you may have to do over time.
And this is maybe the last thing I'll say. So ours is a statewide grant. And so we're trying to understand the New York State service system. And to really do that, we need to talk to all of New York State. But is that reasonable given that we have 1 year and $100,000? So if it's not, what are some other ideas? Can we collect data from New York City, a rural part of the state, and a place like Rochester, and then can we vet it and so it forced us to have research design questions when we had a better idea of what was going to be feasible with our limited budget. Then after the approach for our grant, we had a project impact section. And so, they want, like I think Laura was mentioning this too in a different section of the NIH grant, but they really want to see that your plan is actionable, practical, and realistic. And our funder, they wanted to see that that the project could be sustainable after the grant funding was over. And so we really built that into different elements of our approach and design. Our MOUs included language around sustainability. And so there were other elements of the grant that helped us beef up this section. So maybe that's just like a recommendation to read the full proposal and figure out how you can, reinforce ideas throughout the entire proposal to maximize kind of your points. So you have anything to add on that one?
No, I agree though that I think when you have important points in a proposal, repetition isn't a bad thing. You want to maybe phrase it differently throughout, but if you think there are really important points to drive home, you want it to sort of resound throughout your proposal so that if someone's skimming it, if they miss it in the first part, they'll catch it in the second part.
And I think knowing your funder too, so ACL, they're really into disseminating information, and you see that in a number of their different proposals. And so we took learnings from our USAID grant proposal that we, scored really well on, and then used it in this proposal knowing that it worked. And then the organizational capacity, I can't remember, Laura, what you called it for the NIH, but this is the key personnel that are involved in the grant. describing both our center's experience and the key personnel. So the Strong Center for Developmental Disabilities was the agency going for this project, and we have 40 years history at the University of Rochester Medical Center. So we kind of fleshed that out. We talked about the key personnel and their areas of expertise specifically related to our project. And Laura talked about some of that. You know, Susanna Ayadarola is the PI on this project, and she has, you know, tremendous amounts of experience that wasn't always relevant for what we were doing here. So she really crafted her CV to put our best foot forward for this particular project. And then, you know, really built on our community partners and longstanding relationships with a couple of the key agencies that were also included in the project.
Yeah, and I think one important thing is, you know, when you think about organizational capacity, that's what I called investigators. So I remember when I applied for my first grant, reading the score for investigator was really stressful because it's basically, you know, a room full of people deciding whether you're competent or not. And, you know, when it's your first grant, of course, you're not going to have all this experience that other people have. But I think that's where it's also important to really think about who you can bring into the project to make sure that you have a strong team, because no one person is really going to push a grant forward. It's going to be about the team and the collaboration. So you want to be thoughtful about that and to try to bring in people who have complementary skill sets that really show the reviewers that you'll be able to do this.
That's all we've got for you. Is there any kind of final thoughts, Laura, you want to leave with the group?
No, I would just say thanks for watching. And, you know, I know that grant writing and reviewing is probably not the most exciting topic for everyone, but I think a lot of it is about persuasive writing. And at different points in our careers, wherever we go, we probably have to convince others about things that we think are important, whether they be like initiatives or, you know, who knows what. It could be even the idea like, I think this year we should get holiday gifts for everyone. And you need to come up with a budget and you need to come up with a rationale and convince your boss that it's worth it, even during a recession, you know, something like that. So I would say all of the tips that we included, I think can be used for all different kinds of proposals, you know, whether they be grants or not. But I would also say if any of you end up writing grants, you should feel free to contact us because we're always available to kind of talk things through or give advice or read things over if that's helpful. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.